All right, so let's wrap up this presentation on racism by discussing white privilege. So this is a very difficult concept for white people to wrap our minds around because we live in a society where we are almost taught to feel as if that we've earned and worked for every advantage or everything that we have. And that the color of our skin isn't something that gave us a lot of handouts. What the research, the science tells us is that the color of our skin most certainly does give us an advantage. And again, the evidence that we looked at throughout these previous presentations very clearly demonstrates that. Not only do people of color experience disadvantages, not only do people of color experience prejudice and discrimination in forms of both covert and overt racism, white people also experience advantages or benefits for the color of our skin. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about white privilege. White privilege refers to the benefits people receive simply by being part of the dominant group in terms of race. It's important to note that access to white privilege is not necessarily determined by whether you identify as a white person. Access to white privilege is often determined by how others label your race, right? So for example, I identify as a white person, but if my skin tone is very dark, people may label or treat me as a person of color. Similarly, a person who identifies as a person of color may have very fair skin and may be labeled and therefore treated as a white person in everyday interactions, right? So again, it's just important to note that the way we're treated based off of our race, our ability to access white privilege is largely affected by how others perceive us. Remember, perception is reality. It's very important. One other thing that I'll really emphasize here, I think a reason why a lot of white people get very defensive when we acknowledge just the reality that if we're white, we all have white privilege. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. People get very defensive by that. People will immediately respond to that by saying, well, how could I experience white privilege when I grew up in a single-parent household? We lived in poverty my whole life. How did being white help me in that situation? All right? Listen to this. This is the most important takeaway from this entire presentation. If you feel defensive when we say that all white people have white privilege, it is so important to hear this. Having white privilege does not mean that life is always sunshine and rainbows, okay? Many white people do live in poverty. Many white people do survive paycheck to paycheck. Many white people experience various forms of prejudice and discrimination. But this does not erase the many unearned advantages that being white affords an individual, right? So another way to think of this is that all of the prejudice and discrimination that you experience in your life is valid, right? You may have come from a life of hard knocks. You may have lived in poverty or survived paycheck to paycheck, and that is real. But being white never made those problems worse for you. Being white never disadvantaged you in a way that contributed to those problems, the way that being a person of color likely did impact those problems, right? If you lived in poverty, if you had to live paycheck to paycheck, if you experienced other forms of marginalization or discrimination, it was not because of being white, all right? So that's what we're saying here about white privilege. For people of color, their likelihood of living in poverty is affected by their skin tone. Their likelihood of being expelled or kicked out of school is affected by their skin tone, right? For white people, that's not the same case. So it's not taking away or discrediting the reality that many white people will experience some form of discrimination or oppression in their life, but they will never experience it because of the color of their skin. That's what white privilege is. Here's a short list, and we read earlier in the semester, I asked you to read Peggy McIntosh's Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, where she lists many more instances of privilege, of what white privilege looks like. But here's just a few other examples to really solidify what it means to live in a world where we have white privilege. White privilege is being able to go shopping without having a sales associate keep an eye on me because I look like a potential shoplifter. White privilege is finding my hair care products in the hair care aisle of the store rather than the ethnic hair care aisle. White privilege is being able to easily find a flesh tone bandage in any first aid kit. White privilege is being able to walk down the sidewalk without having people cross to the other side of the street out of fear that I'll mug them. White privilege is accurately learning about the history of my race in school and consistently seeing my race represented in all my textbooks. White privilege is frequently seeing and hearing my race speaking as a voice of authority in politics, education, and virtually every other institution in the United States. White privilege is not having the fear of potentially being shot by a police officer if I get pulled over for a routine traffic violation. White privilege is knowing that just because Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer were rapists and serial killers, other people won't automatically assume that I and all my white friends are as well. White privilege is having great-great-grandparents who are legally allowed to own property and establish wealth that they could pass down to my parents. And white privilege is having the ability to choose to remain willfully ignorant to systemic racism because it will never affect me personally in a negative way. This is a brief list. I could have written hundreds of these things. All right, these are privileges, unearned benefits that I have been afforded simply because of the color of my skin in society. These are not things that people of color are afforded in our society. Okay? This is what white privilege is. And it's these small things. Many of these probably don't seem like that big of a deal. You know, some of them obviously are. Others may seem really trivial. But imagine the extra stress it would add to your life if you had to deal with minor inconveniences like these every single day. Think of the added mental stress. Think of, the physical consequences that it would have on your health. Think about how challenging and how irritating and annoying and stressful life would be having to overcome these little microaggressions every single day. Right? White privilege is real. Briefly here, let's talk about the three theoretical perspectives on race. Functionalism would question if racial prejudice and discrimination are functional for society by producing in-group solidarity. I'm not really loving functionalism here in that regard. Racial prejudice and discrimination, there's really no way for me to wrap my mind around those being functional in any way for society. It causes harm to society. Conflict theory, on the other hand, can be very helpful in this regard. Conflict theory would suggest that access to power and scarce resources, such as income and wealth, are largely affected by race. Having access to white privilege affords power to white people, while racism impacts the ability of people of color to achieve upward social mobility. So according to conflict theory, white people have power in our society. Our society, again, was built on systemic racism. It was built on slavery. And as a result, white people had power, and they built a society that enables them to maintain their power. And we see this today based off of all the examples of the studies that we've covered, how racism, white privilege is still built into all these different institutions in our society, from medicine to education to the legal system, etc. White people are still privileged, and it's because white people built the United States. They built this society that we live in today. And as a result, they built it in a way that was going to encourage the protection of white people and white power and disadvantage people of color. So we have a lot of work if we want to undo this centuries of racism that are existing in our society. Symbolic interactionism would suggest that the unconscious meanings and biases we attach to race are learned through social interactions, and that the racial labels and stereotypes that we come to know are a result of our socialization. So a good thing from this regard of symbolic interactionism, if we learn the racial biases that we have, if we learn those through socialization, there's definitely things that we can do to unlearn them as well, right? As human beings, we are constantly being socialized, and our perceptions can change on things. The symbols and the meanings that we attach to things can change. So how can we work as individuals in our society to address racial biases that we have? What can we do to combat racism as a social problem in our society? Well, here's a link to a website called Teaching Tolerance, which is just a wonderful resource, not just for racism, but for a lot of different social issues. So I include the link here if you want to go and visit that website. They offer, different readings and videos and lesson plans and things of that nature to help educate yourself and educate others about sensitive political and social issues. But what can white people specifically do to help fight racism and to break down any racial biases that we have? Well, first and foremost, don't take it personally or use discomfort as an excuse to disengage. If your instincts tell you it's more comfortable to retreat or reassure yourself that you're not racist, Think instead, what actions can I take to help? All right? Again, acknowledging that we have white privilege doesn't take away from other forms of oppression or marginalization that we've experienced. We just need to know that it exists. We need to accept that racism is still a problem affecting society today. And it's time that we lean into these uncomfortable conversations and question how we've benefited from white privilege, how we've been able to turn a blind eye to racism for so long, and most importantly, what are we going to do now that we have this awareness of these problems to address them? The first thing that we should always do is educate ourselves. But it's important to note that we shouldn't expect people of color to have to teach us about racism, right? It's not their job. While it's okay to ask questions to people of color who have expressed a willingness to answer them, we as individuals have the power to educate ourselves, and we need to do that. So actively look out, read, watch, and listen to articles, books, documentaries, and podcasts on race and racism, especially those that are produced by people of color. Share the knowledge that we gain with our family and friends and others who we think would benefit. And lastly, learn when to listen, learn when to amplify, and learn when to speak up. We're going to close watching a video here of a very powerful interaction that an individual had.
My sister-in-law, who's half black, half white, but looks white, blue eyes, whiter than most white folks, very white. She and I, we kind of grew up together. We raised our children together. So they're first cousins, and it's a wonderful, very, very multicultural family. So we're going in a Safeway one day. And Kathleen, my sister-in-law, is in front of me, and she's, writing a check for her groceries. Now, my daughter, who at the time was 10 years old, was standing with me, and I was directly behind her, getting ready to get my groceries. So Kathleen comes up, and the checker, who is a strawberry blonde, freckled, very delightful, warm, the checker, this young woman, is talking to Kathleen. Hey, how you doing? This is a nice day today. They're just chatting up. And she says, yeah. So Kathy writes her check, and she steps off to the side with her groceries because she's waiting for me. Of course, again, Kathleen looks white, right? So I come up. No conversation. She looks up at me. Absolutely no, just a little chatter. And I write my check. My daughter, however, is 10, notices immediately the difference in how she responds to me. So I write my check, and she goes, I'm going to need 2 pieces of ID. At which point my daughter looks at me, and she gets very, very embarrassed, and tears are kind of coming up in her eye, like, Mommy, you're not gonna let her do this. Why is she doing this to us, right? So I'm trying to figure out what I should do, because behind me are 2 elderly white women, right? And I'm thinking, okay, so then I become the angry black woman, right? And they're gonna be, and I'm just trying to second guess all the drama. So then I just give her the 2 pieces of ID. I said, some things you got to choose your battles, right? And then it gets worse. She pulls out the bad check book, right? So this is the book that shows the people who've written bad checks. So she starts searching for my license in the bad checks, at which point it's just out of control now. Just as I'm standing there, trying to decide what to do, and it's really deeply humiliating. Now my daughter is in full-blown emotionally upset, who's 10. My sister-in-law walks back over, and she steps in and she says, excuse me, why are you doing this? And the checker goes, well, what do you mean? She goes, why are you taking her through all of these changes? Why are you doing that? She goes, well, this is our policy. She goes, no, it's not your policy, because you didn't do that with me. Oh, well, I know you've been. She goes, no, she's been here for years. I've only lived here for 3 months. And so at this point, the 2 white elderly ladies go, I can't believe what this checker has done with this woman. It is totally unacceptable. At which point the manager walks over. So the manager walks over and says, is there a problem here? And then my sister-in-law again responds. She goes, yes, there is a problem here. Here is what happened. So you see, she used her white privilege. And even though Kathleen is half black and half white, she recognizes what that means. And she made the statement. She pointed out the injustice. And she, as a result of that one act, influenced everyone in that space. But what would have happened? I can't know for certain had the black woman said, this is unfair. Why are you doing this to me? Would it have had the same impact? But Kathleen knew that she walked through the world differently than I did. And she used her white privilege to educate and make right a situation that was wrong. That's what you can do. every single day.